I do not understand why nothing is done for my people. I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Good words do not last long unless they amount to something. Words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country, now overrun by the white men. They do not protect my father's grave. They do not pay for all my horses and cattle. Good words will not give me back my children. Good words will not make good the promise of your war chief, General Miles. Good words will not give my people good health and stop them from dying. Good words will not get my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all of the good words and all of the broken promises. These are the words of Chief Joseph, a man who, despite his best efforts to keep the peace, was driven to war, leading his people on one of the greatest fighting retreats in all of American history. It all began in 1877, after years of broken treaties, stolen land, and unprovoked killings. And what followed was a 1,400-mile running battle. 750 Nez Perce men, women, and children facing off against over 2,000 U.S. troops. Before it was all said and done, hundreds would perish. And life for the Nez Perce would never be the same again. But who was Chief Joseph? What was his early life like? How was he raised? How did a peaceful tribe like the Nez Perce find themselves at war against the United States of America? And how did one single gunshot trigger one of the most dramatic episodes in all of the American West? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. I want you to imagine most of central Idaho, from Boise on up to Coeur d'Alene and then east to the Continental Divide. Toss in northeastern Oregon and southeastern Washington, and you've got a pretty decent idea of the roughly 14 million acres that the Nez Perce once called home. That name, by the way, Nez Perce, was originally bestowed on them by French-Canadian fur trappers. It literally means pierced nose. And despite the fact that they never actually pierced their noses, the name stuck. Be that as it may, they refer to themselves as the Nimipu, or the people. And the land they called home provided the people with all they could possibly need, not only to live, but to thrive. Per historian and author Ken Nurburn, who actually once lived among the Nez Perce, quote, "The Nez Perce were not a warlike people. Their land provided all they needed, and their interest in casual warfare was almost non-existent. As with all peoples, they had neighbors with whom they were on better terms, and neighbors for which they had no good feelings. But their land was big, their lives were good, and the Creator had blessed them with a place on earth that provided them with all the material wealth they needed. Their only consistent clashes were with the Shoshone and the Paiute to the south, who often encroached upon Nez Perce hunting and gathering lands. But even these clashes were sporadic and episodic, and seldom engaged in except to redress grievances or as by a means which young men could achieve personal honor or increase their status as warriors. Beyond these encounters, the Nez Perce were content to let all people live in peace where the Creator had placed them, and they expected others to do the same." End of quote. Now, in addition to hunting for deer and elk and harvesting salmon, the Nez Perce would occasionally cross the Rockies to take buffalo. They also relied heavily on camas, or as it's known scientifically, camisea, a type of plant utilized as a dietary staple. Now, me personally, I have never tried it, but from what I understand, the camas bulbs would either be pit roasted or boiled, or sometimes even dried and pounded into a flour. I've even read that if prepared correctly, it almost tastes like sweet potatoes. Now, in addition to all that hunting and gathering, the Nez Perce also made one hell of a name for themselves as horse breeders. The general consensus is that they probably didn't obtain horses until around the year 1730, but within just 2 decades, they had already established breeding herds and specialized their own selective breeding practices. If you've ever admired the beautiful Appaloosa breed of horse, you can thank the Nez Perce. That was all them. Wasn't long before other tribes wanted in on the action, and that being the case, the Nez Perce became a very viable force in an extremely vast trading network. Just to give you an idea of how quickly goods traveled across the West back in those days, when the Lewis and Clark expedition wintered in North Dakota in 1804, they traded quite a few axes and hatchets with the Mandan. And then, a few months later, when the expedition reached the other side of the Rocky Mountains, they were astonished to discover some of these very same tools among the Nez Perce. And yeah, these were the people and the culture that Chief Joseph was born into sometime in the year 1840 in Oregon's Woolala Valley. And no, his given name at birth was neither Chief nor Joseph. In all actuality, he'd come to be known as, oh boy, I'm going to really struggle with this one, Hinmatu Ya Latkek. Hinmatu Ya Latkek. It basically means thunder rolling down the mountain. Now, I'm no linguistic expert, obviously, but I can't help but wonder if Joseph may have had a bit of trouble with diarrhea as a baby. Either way, to most people, he was simply known as Young Joseph, at least while his father, Tikakis, was still alive. Tikakis himself was given the name Joseph when he was baptized into the Christian faith, so he was Old Joseph, whereas his son was Young Joseph. And that's another thing. By the time Joseph was born in 1840, the missionaries had already arrived. In fact, Joseph himself never experienced a life that was not impacted, one way or the other, by white men. I'm not going to go too in-depth on it today, but their interactions with outsiders, especially the missionaries, would have a very profound impact. There were a ton of converts, including Joseph's father, and many of these converts began living like the missionaries themselves, growing crops, living in log homes, and even dressing like them. Not young Joseph, though. He still spent his formative years practicing the traditional Nez Perce ways, including their religion. He hunted for meat, he learned how to track and forage, became an expert horseman, all the usual skills attained by Nez Perce warriors. There was just one catch, though. You see, Joseph was slated to become chief, just like his daddy. And that being the case, he wasn't really allowed to roughhouse with the other boys. Guess it just wasn't considered dignified. He was also held to a higher standard. If his playmates got into trouble, it was Joseph who was punished. The idea being that as a leader, he would be responsible for the actions of those around him. And that being the case, Joseph grew up to be a very thoughtful and quiet young man, and naturally keeping his eyes open and his mouth shut, and also not letting his anger overtake his ability to make rational decisions. And just a real quick tangent regarding Joseph's pre-selection as chief. As is the case with many other tribes, the role of chief was not strictly hereditary. Even the Nez Perce had their own methods of choosing their leaders. So while Joseph was selected at an early age to become chief, it was not a guarantee. He still had to earn the title. Now, back in those days, the Nez Perce numbered in the several thousand, and they were split up into 50 smaller bands, each with their own territories and leaders. As for Joseph and his people, they belonged to the Woolala band, whose main territory was, any guesses? That's right, the Woolala Valley. I think I'm saying that correctly, Woolala. Listen, I'm going to get a lot of names wrong during this series. Part of it's just my own ignorance, and part of it is an actual legitimate speech impediment. There are just some words or combinations of letters that I cannot say. I am trying though, so please bear with me. I will make mistakes. And my apologies to any Nez Perce who may be listening. I promise, I mean no disrespect. Now, if you're looking at a map, the Woolala Valley is basically the northeastern corner of present-day Oregon. Very beautiful area, but at the same time, very wild and remote. In other words, it was a veritable Garden of Eden for the Nez Perce. Sadly, however, by the time Joseph reached his teens, this paradise was increasingly being encroached upon by outsiders, sorts who didn't necessarily have his people's best interest at heart. Worth noting that the Woolala Valley was not just where Joseph grew up. It also legally belonged to the tribe per the 1855 Treaty of Walla Walla. Despite signing away some 5.5 million acres, the Nez Perce still retained another 7 million acres in what's now Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. What's more, they could still hunt and even graze their horses on unoccupied land outside of that designated territory. Land, of course, which had previously belonged to them in the first place. The only problem was gold was discovered just a few years later near present-day Pierce, Idaho. And I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Thousands of prospectors flocked to the area, illegally mind you, and following in their wake came the ranchers and the homesteaders. Very similar to what occurred in the Black Hills in the 1870s. Federal government either couldn't or wouldn't stem the tide, so rather than enforce the treaty, they simply went ahead and further reduced the land of the Nez Perce by 90%. The new treaty in 1863 would come to be known as the Thief Treaty on account of it being signed by just one Nez Perce chief. That's it, just one dude signed away 90% of their land, and the government just sort of went along with it. something that Joseph himself would explain years later when he stated, "Suppose a white man should come to me and say, 'Joseph, I like your horses and I want to buy them.' And I say to him, 'No, my horses suit me and I will not sell them.' And then he goes to my neighbor and says to him, 'Joseph has some good horses. I want to buy them, but he refuses to sell.' My neighbor answers, 'Pay me the money and I will sell you Joseph's horses.' The white man returns to me and says, 'Joseph, I have bought your horses and you must let me have them. If we sold our lands to the government, this is the way they were bought.'" End of quote. Imagine that, the government stealing things. Who'd have thunk it? Now, as egregious as this treaty was, several of the bands did go ahead and move to the Lapwai Reservation in Idaho. Not Joseph, though. He and his father's band continued residing right there in the Woolala Valley. Treaty be damned. And believe it or not, they found an unlikely ally in then President Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, Grant would end up issuing an executive order banning white settlers from half of the valley. So once again, Joseph and his people saw their remaining territory reduced by 50%. I guess the only upside was they weren't forced to move to the reservation over in Idaho. At least not yet. Sadly, Grant's orders would be reversed just 2 years later when the entire valley was open to settlement. By this point, Joseph's father, Takakis, had a pretty decent handle on what was going on. He advised his son to, quote, "Never accept any gifts, for they will say that you sold something. Take no pay, sign no paper. Don't even touch a white man's paper with your hand, or they will say you have agreed to what it contains." He then implored Joseph to continue protecting the land even after he was gone, and to never sell the bones of his mother and father, saying that a man that would not defend his father's grave was worse than a wild beast. So hopefully by this point, you're kind of starting to get an idea, somewhat, of just how badly the Nez Perce were screwed over. And trust me when I say, this is not even the half of it. It is a very familiar story though, right? Something that's been repeated time and time again throughout North America. It always starts with a trickle of immigrants just passing through, or so they say. The only thing is, that trickle eventually becomes a flood, and then the whole pretense of passing through goes straight out the window once gold is discovered, or fertile land, or pretty much anything else the settlers wanted to take by force. The thing that really seems to set the Nez Perce apart from other tribes like the Comanche or Lakota or even the Apache is that they were not raiding the American settlements. Okay, they did not go to war over the 1855 treaty that reduced their land by nearly half. Nor did they go to war after the Thief Treaty reduced it to just 10% of what it once was. Even when that executive order was reversed, allowing white settlers to flood into the Woolala Valley, the Nez Perce still did not take to the warpath. Now, Joseph's father Takakis would pass away in 1871, right there in the valley, at which point a 31-year-old Joseph took over the role as chief. Keep in mind that we're still talking about just one band of the Nez Perce, okay? Joseph was not chief over the entire nation, just his little group of around 250 or 300 people. It's also important to note that Joseph was not a celebrated warrior. Hell, he didn't even have a reputation of being a great hunter. Matter of fact, by the time he became chief, he had only crossed the mountains once to hunt for buffalo. I only point this out because there are some who think that maybe Joseph gets a little too much glory, especially in regard to the upcoming Nez Perce War. He also may have done a few things that his fellow tribal members weren't all that proud of. And don't worry, we will touch on all of this later on. For now, though, I'm just sort of laying the groundwork. As far as Joseph was concerned, in 1871, he was content just to lead his little band in the same way that his father had, devoting his life to the protection of the people and what remained of their territory. And when he learned of how Grant rescinded that order that gave Joseph's band half of the Woolala Valley, he called a meeting of all the other non-treaty chiefs. Several of these leaders would call for war, but Joseph and another chief, a guy by the name of Looking Glass, urged restraint. They knew full well that a war would not only be unwinnable, but it would also cause the people to needlessly suffer even further. Many of the religious leaders sided with Joseph and Looking Glass, so for the time being at least, the Nez Perce resolved to remain peaceful. Sadly, these little meetings did not go unnoticed, and the aggressions from the settlers would only continue. To once again quote historian Kent Nurburn, "On all fronts, the situation was accelerating and deteriorating. From this point forward, every small encounter was fraught with significance. An old Indian man shooing away some settlers' horses from his herd was accused of driving a white man's horse from their rightful grazing grounds. Tribal members who traveled to visit distant relatives were suspected of gathering to hold war councils. White men, frustrated with the government's indecisiveness, began moving into Woolala, taking over pasturage and even building a toll road. End of quote. And yeah, finally in June of 1876, one of Joseph's buddies, a guy known as Wind Blowing, was shot and killed after being falsely accused of stealing horses. He was definitely innocent, by the way. In fact, the supposedly stolen horses were located just a few days later, grazing near the owner's property. But that was it. That was the single solitary shot that kicked off this entire war. Just not yet. Believe it or not, the Nez Perce still remained peaceful. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of them, especially the younger men, who were ready to hit the warpath. But Joseph was able to restrain them, at least temporarily. Hell, he'd even go so far as to meet with General Oliver Otis Howard, who was basically doing whatever was necessary to keep the peace. By the way, I am sort of glossing over certain events. The death of Windblowing did not occur in a vacuum. There had been countless other issues leading up to it, mostly aggressions on the part of the settlers. Matter of fact, one of the guys who had killed Windblowing, a whiskey peddler named McNall, would make it a point to castrate any Nez Perce horses that he found near his property. Others had taken to physically assaulting or whipping the Nez Perce, and there are even stories of their women being raped. And in the weeks and months that followed, other Nez Perce were killed. And still, through it all, Joseph maintained the peace. Now, like I said, he would meet with both General Howard's representatives and the general himself on more than one occasion. Not only was Howard very much impressed with Joseph's demeanor and leadership abilities, but he also promised that Windblowing's murderers would be brought to justice. And I really do think that Howard meant well, at least at this juncture, but he only had so much authority. He would call for the arrest of the murderers, that much is true, but the settlers just flat out ignored him, which once again caused the patience of the Nez Perce to be stretched to the limit. While they wouldn't make any overtly hostile moves, they did start employing various intimidation tactics. Young warriors began riding around in the open, painted for war. They also started putting on public displays of target practice, basically doing whatever they could to scare the shit out of the settlers without actually hurting anyone. Meanwhile, Joseph issued an ultimatum. He told the homesteaders there in the valley that they had 1 week to turn over the killers and to get the hell out. 7 days. And if they refused to do so, he would unleash his warriors and burn all of their properties to the ground. And sure enough, just as soon as those 7 days had expired without the murderers being held accountable, Joseph unleashed absolute hell. The Woolala Valley ran red with blood as the Nez Perce slaughtered over 900 settlers, raping women, killing babies, and even torturing the settlers' puppies and kitty cats. And no, that is absolutely not true. Joseph did give that ultimatum, but it was just a bluff. Even after that week had passed and the killers remained free, Joseph still managed to restrain his warriors. Hell, he even helped to restrain the warriors belonging to other bands of Nez Perce. What's more, when the soldiers arrived and assured Joseph that Windblowing's killer would eventually be punished, and asking pretty please that he tell his men to stop scaring the ever-loving shit out of the settlers, he agreed. He even had his warriors make a show of unloading their rifles. I cannot stress this enough. Chief Joseph desperately wanted peace, and he was willing to do whatever he could to maintain the peace. Now, eventually, General Howard did have the killers tried for murder, but they were found not guilty, based solely on their own testimony. Basically just a kangaroo court. And even then, the Nez Perce did not take to the warpath. They weren't happy, but they still didn't take the law into their own hands. That said, there just weren't no two ways about it. They and the settlers couldn't remain living together indefinitely there in the same valley without future violence. It was bound to happen. Everybody knew it. Another member of the band would eventually get murdered, or some young hothead warriors would lash out in retribution, and all hell would break loose. So General Howard's solution, his way of ensuring that peace would remain unbroken, was to evict the Nez Perce. That's right, the people who had done absolutely nothing wrong were now being punished. I want you to think about that for a moment. Imagine that you and your family had been living in the same house for years. A house that went all the way back to your great-great-grandparents. And then all of a sudden some new neighbors move in next door. They're loud, they're inconsiderate, they don't respect your property line. Hell, they even start parking their vehicles in your driveway. You try talking to them, but they don't listen. Finally, one of them walks up to you one day while you're mowing your yard and just punches you in the face completely unprovoked. So you call the police, thinking maybe that they can help. The only thing is, rather than place your crazy neighbor under arrest, they instead advise you to move. And when you say that you don't want to move, that you really like living in the house, the same house that your great-great-grandparents lived in, the officer responds by saying that's too bad and that you have to move, and that if you don't move, we'll arrest you. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying things here, but this is basically what was happening to the Nez Perce. These people were harming literally nobody. They were just trying to live their best lives on the same piece of dirt that their grandparents had lived on. That was their only crime. That and not being white, if we're being completely honest. It makes no logical sense. But like I said, General Howard ordered them out of the valley. There were negotiations, but they didn't go so well. I guess Howard was expecting Joseph and the other non-treaty chiefs to be more agreeable to his ridiculous orders. By the way, speaking of the other chiefs, you had the aforementioned Looking Glass of the Alpawa Band. You had Whitebird of the Lamada Band, and another guy by the name of Tuhulzaholt, who was in charge of the Picunan Band. And yes, I probably butchered all of those names, but it was these chiefs, along with Joseph, who were responsible for somewhere between 600 to 800 Nez Perce, the vast majority of whom were women and children. That left just 200 men, and out of all those men, only about half of them were considered to be of prime fighting age. Now, eventually, these numbers would be supplemented by other bands and even 25 Palouse warriors, bringing their total number of fighters to around 250, which is crazy to think about, especially considering what they'd be able to accomplish against thousands of soldiers. But we'll get to that soon enough. By the way, it's worth noting that General Howard did not like Joseph's fellow chief, Tuhulzaholt. The two of them got to arguing during a council in May of 1877, with Tuhulzaholt asking Howard, quote, "Who are you to tell me what to do? What person pretends to divide the land and put me on it? I am chief here. No man can come and tell me anything." End quote. He then followed that up by telling Howard to go play general in his own country. I like this guy. Howard responded by telling Tuhulzaholt that he must comply or else, quote, "My orders are plain and will be executed. You will go onto the land or I will send soldiers to put you on it." To which Tuhulzaholt replied, "I am a man. I have a prick. You will not tell me what to do." I really like this guy. By the way, this council, which was held at Fort Lapway in Idaho in May of 1877, was also attended by Joseph and the other non-treaty chiefs. I just wanted to make that clear before we went any further. But yeah, apparently old Chief Tuhulzaholt didn't put up with no bullshit. Hell, he had Howard so aggravated that the general would end up placing him under arrest and taking him to the guardhouse. Tuhulzaholt was also beaten and stripped of his clothing. And when they finally turned him loose, he was wearing a woman's gown they had forced on him. In the words of the Nez Perce, General Howard had showed his rifle, meaning that he had violated the integrity of the peace talks. Not only by placing Tuhulzaholt under arrest, but just by the general level of disrespect and mistreatment. This was a big fucking deal to the Nez Perce, but Chief Joseph was once again able to maintain peace. I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record at this point, but the restraint that Joseph showed is very, very impressive. Especially considering that Tuhulzaholt's warriors were chomping at the bit to avenge the honor of their chief. Likewise for the warriors under Chief Whitebird, and they too had a damn good reason to be upset. Some of their people had likewise been mistreated and even killed by the settlers. There was even one old lady in Whitebird's band who was literally hacked to death after her dog got into a fight with a dog belonging to a white family. Another man who was half blind was shot dead for the horrible crime of complaining about a fence. So yeah, their desire to fight back is definitely understandable. But like I keep saying, Joseph was able to keep things from getting too far out of control. He even swallowed his pride big time and agreed that all of the non-treaty Nez Perce should leave their homeland and move to that reservation over in Idaho. Huge concession on his part. He even got the other bands to go along with it. In turn, Howard gave them just 30 days to pack up and get gone. And if they failed to meet the deadline, he promised to send in the troops. I don't think the Nez Perce were necessarily afraid of General Howard or his threats. As you'll soon come to learn, they were pretty badass when it came to fighting. And had they refused to leave, I'm relatively certain they would have made quick work of the general's troops. Hell, they could have probably even handled the reinforcements without breaking much of a sweat. But they were also smart enough to realize that the army would never stop. These weren't just raids between rival tribes. The Americans would just keep coming with more and more soldiers, and even if the Nez Perce had somehow managed to hold them off, at the very least they would end up paying a terrible price. So they agreed to Howard's demands. I mean, after all, it wasn't exactly the end of the world, right? It wasn't like they were being shipped to Florida like the Apache or even Oklahoma. At least not yet. They would still be on Nez Perce land. Just a tiny, tiny portion of it. And who knows, maybe if they played ball, they would eventually be able to return to their beloved Woolala Valley at some point in the future. According to historian Ken Nerburn, quote, in early June of 1877, 3 weeks after the conclusion of Howard's council at the Lapway, Joseph's people rode solemnly down the narrow trail from the Woolala towards the turbulent Snake River. It was a steep vertical descent of almost a mile on narrow, winding paths. The footing was still treacherous from the winter snows, and it only got worse as the heavy hooves of the cattle and horses churned the earth into a viscous, slippery mud. Howard's heartless timetable, which had required them to be on the reservation by June 14th, had made it impossible for them to gather all of their stock from the wide prairies and hills. It had also assured that the newly born calves and colts would have little chance of surviving the journey. Even if they made it down the slippery, perilous trails, they would surely drown as they tried to cross the half-mile wide Snake River, which was roaring with its winter runoff. Joseph had made the hard decision. He had chosen to abandon the land that held the bones of his father and mother in order to save the lives of the people who had been entrusted in his care. The violation of his oath to his father weighed heavily upon him, but it was to the living that he knew he must be responsible. To do otherwise was to violate the sacred trust of leadership. Though the people were long practiced in making bull boats by building frames of willow and covering them with buffalo hide, these small bowl-like boats were good only for carrying people and a few household goods. They would be of no service to getting the cattle and horses across. The only hope was the people's knowledge of currents and water patterns. By entering the river at the right point, they could literally allow themselves to be carried across to the other side by the eddies and current. But once outside these hidden passageways, any boat or animal would be swept to its destruction in the fast-moving turbulence. Even with the young boys leading the horses across with ropes, many would be carried away to be crushed against the rocks. And the cattle almost had no chance. They were poor swimmers and panicked easily. Only by sheer luck would any of them survive. As to the people, most would make it to safety. But it was cruel to see the blind being led by ropes down the trails, and the infirm elderly trying to hobble with the aid of sticks and tree branches. Goods that not be carried had been cached in holes and hollows and covered with earth and furs. But all knew that the whites were watching and would steal everything as soon as the Indians had crossed the river, just as they had stolen the people's horses and cattle when they found that the Nez Perce were forced to leave. The sad truth was that the people were leaving their homeland for the last time, and all felt it in their hearts. End of quote. And yeah, sure enough, the majority of their cattle did indeed perish trying to cross the Snake. Rather than see the rest drown when they tried crossing the salmon, they instead decided to leave them behind. This ended up working out somewhat in their favor as they decided to hold one last council over at Tolo Lake, just a few miles west of present-day Grangeville, Idaho. Joining Joseph and his band were a few of those other chiefs I mentioned previously, along with a small number of Palouse under Chief Baldhead. By the way, this area where they stopped, part of what's known as the Camas Prairie, is very close to the reservation. I'm talking like less than 20 miles. And they arrived early, either on June 2nd or June 3rd. Per historian Daniel Scharfstein, quote, "The campground just outside the reservation boundaries was an oasis of normalcy. After experiencing an arduous journey and the loss of their land, Joseph's people had reached a place they knew well. They had often traveled here. Despite the catastrophic change in their lives, the blue-flowered prairie was as it had always been. It was almost as if the previous month had not happened. Here, their days passed in familiar work, familiar play, and the familiar company of the other non-treaty bands led by Whitebird, Duholzaholt, and Looking Glass. After Joseph's bands had raised their teepees and settled in, the chief, his brother, and a small party made their journey back across the salmon to slaughter cattle. They left their people just as they were beginning to find comfort in the resilience of the old ways. End of quote. Now, Joseph and his small party wouldn't return with the meat until well over a week later, at which point things had taken a very drastic turn for the worse. In his absence, the people had decided to stage a ceremonial circle to commemorate past battles, and one of the young men who took part in the circle was a warrior named Wallititz. Once again, I know I'm probably horribly butchering his name. I believe it translates to shore crossing. But either way, a few of the other warriors began giving Wallititz a hard time. See, his father Eagle Robe was among the Nez Perce who had been murdered by settlers back in Oregon. So they were basically asking him why he was pretending to be a warrior when he had failed to avenge his father's death, even though his father had supposedly made him swear not to avenge his death. According to Kent Nurburn, quote, the criticism had stung Wallititz deeply. After a night of tearful indecision, caught between his promise to his father and the insulting challenge of his peers, he had gathered his two cousins and ridden off in the direction of the cabin where the man who had killed his father lived. End of quote. Now, luckily for the guy in question, Larry Ott, he was not at home when Wallititz and the others arrived. And rather than just stick around, they instead found another settler a few miles upriver, a guy by the name of Richard Devine. Much like Ott, Devine had shed Nez Perce blood, and needless to say, they made quick work of him. Their next target was a German immigrant, Henry Elfers. He had allegedly supported Ott's killing of Wallititz's father, and was even heard referring to the Nez Perce as dogs. They left their horses in the middle of Elfers' field and hid in the brush. They watched him come out and inspect the mounts, and saw his curiosity turn into fear when he realized they belonged to the Nez Perce. And when he took off running, they jumped out and tackled him, and then shot him at point-blank range. Important to note that Elfers' family were left unmolested. The warriors actually rode right past his wife and kids as they were churning milk, without so much as laying a hand on them. Now at this point, they turned their horses back towards Lake Tolo, but as fate would have it, their journey took them past the home of Samuel Benedict. He too had killed a Nez Perce at some point in the recent past. He was also well known for cheating them out of their trade goods. So Wallititz and his cousins evened the score. They shot Benedict in both of his legs and left him there to die. By the following evening, Wallititz was joined by over a dozen other young warriors, all of whom were looking to raise a little hell. Keep in mind that Joseph was not aware of any of this. He was still back between the snake and the salmon, butchering cattle. By the time he returned in mid-June, the entire camp was in complete disarray. Hell, some of the bands had already left, and others were in the process of breaking down their teepees. Guess they figured they'd get the hell gone before the soldiers arrived. So Joseph did what he had always done. He became the voice of reason and urged the people to remain calm. If they packed up and hauled ass now, then the soldiers would just assume they were guilty and attack at first sight. It was Joseph's opinion that it would be better for all involved if they were just to wait there and speak with General Howard and try to explain the situation. Not everyone agreed, though. Others felt like they'd be punished no matter what. You also got to remember that Joseph was not the only chief who was there, okay? The other warriors didn't trust him as much as his own people did, and they damn sure weren't obligated to follow his orders. Per historian Daniel Scharfstein, quote, by nightfall, Joseph's band was alone at Lake Tolo. Familiar ground, but a new world. Before midnight, Joseph's nephew, Yellow Wolf, woke from sleep inside of the chief's teepee. He heard hoofbeats drumming on the ground, closer, louder, stopping just shy of camp. Voices in the darkness, words Yellow Wolf could not understand. It was a group of whites. They kept their distance, but Joseph's band knew they were there. For a while, the riders did nothing. Why had they come? Then the crack of a rifle pierced the night, and a bullet ripped through Joseph's teepee. Yellow Wolf grabbed his rifle and forced himself from the warmth of the teepee into the cold air outside. He fired as the horses galloped away. Again and again all night long, the riders kept coming back, only to retreat when Joseph's men tried to engage them. At sunrise, exhausted, Yellow Wolf heard Joseph resignedly say, we must pack and go to where the other chiefs are. If white vengeance would be inevitable and indiscriminate, if war was unavoidable, then Joseph would cast his lot with Whitebird and Tehulzahult. From that time, the chief's nephew would recall, the Nez Perce had no more rest. End of quote. And yeah, this would mark the beginning of the flight of the Nez Perce, or what many of us now know as the Nez Perce War. and by the time the smoke settled, well over 100 US soldiers would be dead. The Nez Perce would lose around the same amount, and as I alluded to in the intro, life would never again be the same. And I think that's as good a place as any to call it a day. Please join me next time as we continue discussing Joseph and the Nez Perce. By the way, just a very quick disclaimer before you head out. I mentioned earlier that the name Nez Perce came from French-Canadian fur trappers. And while I'm sure the original French sounded something along the lines of Nez Perce, I have personally chosen to go with a more modern-day pronunciation of Nez Perce. Why? Because that's the way the actual tribal members themselves say it. Exactly as I am, Nez Perce. Look, I know a lot of people were told that it was Nez Perce, probably even by their teachers back in school. But if you're looking for a second opinion, or maybe if you just don't want to take my word for it, all you gotta do is a quick search on YouTube. Type in something like Nez Perce Elders or Nez Perce Language, and I promise you, you will find actual Nez Perce tribal members saying it just like I am. And the only reason I bring this up, I'm not trying to sound like a know-it-all or anything like that. I promise you, I am a very stupid person. But I actually covered the Nez Perce War several years ago, and to this day, I still get the occasional comment or email correcting my pronunciation. And by the way, I do get a lot of words wrong, and I started doubting myself, so I actually reached out to a lady who lives on the Nez Perce reservation, and she was nice enough to explain the proper pronunciation. One more thing, and I promise I'll let you go. As I mentioned a moment ago, I have previously covered Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce War, like over 4 years ago. And I just felt like it was time for a redo. If you're a longtime listener, this is not a verbatim re-recording of what I had previously released. I have included new information, and I've even made a few corrections, and I just gave the script a bit of a facelift. A few weeks ago, I said that I would also be doing the same to the Billy the Kid series, and that is still in the works. That is definitely going to happen. So hopefully by the time this series on Chief Joseph is done, we'll dive straight into Billy the Kid. I also have a lot of other shorter episodes I'm working on that I'll be dropping in between. Things are a little hectic now. I'm releasing content very sporadically. I went from once a week to like 2 or 3 times a week publishing new content. Look, there's no way I can keep up this tempo. I can already feel the burnout starting to creep in, so most likely next week or the week after, we will go back to posting just 1 episode per week. Same day as always on Wednesdays. Oh yeah, I just wanted to give you that quick heads up and let you know what's been going on. All right, till next time, be good to one another, and adios.